Thank you for watching this video. This is the third installment of the Echoes of Elysium saga. For the first two chapters, please follow the link in the description below. Now on to the story. The battle began with a fierce barrage of energy weapons and turrets as the two fleets clashed in the void. Captain Vance watched the carnage unfold before her, her heart heavy with the knowledge that many of those she fought alongside would not survive the day. But she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Their ships were designed for stealth, and they were able to slip past the enemy defenses, closing in on the Keystone undetected. Captain Vance's heart pounded with anticipation as they drew nearer. She could see the ancient artifact now, its glowing form suspended in the void, surrounded by a haze of energy. The enemy fleet was closing in as well, their weapons trained on the Starbound and her crew. All hands, prepare to board the Keystone. Captain Vance shouted through the comm, weapons teams, target the enemy flagship. Take it out, and the rest will fall into line. The crew sprang into action, racing through the halls of the ship and toward the airlocks. Captain Vance stayed behind, monitoring the battle from the bridge. The enemy flagship exploded in a blinding flash of light and debris, but the enemy fleet did not falter. They continued to fire upon the Starbound, their weapons tearing through the ship with deadly precision. "Ship systems are failing," came a voice over the comm. "We need to abandon ship, Captain." Captain Vance's heart ached at the loss of her home, but she knew there was no other choice. "Aye, Mr. Scott. Evacuate the ship and regroup. We'll continue the fight from our fighters." As the crew began to evacuate, Captain Vance watched her ship crumble around her. The bridge was hit, and she was forced to eject from her chair, tumbling through the air and colliding with the deck. Her vision swam, and she struggled to breathe. She felt a stabbing pain in her side as she hit the floor. "Captain?" came a voice from above her. One of her crew, a young ensign, was kneeling beside her, his face etched with concern. "Go," she gasped, pushing herself up with one arm. "Get to the fighters and protect the team. I'll be right behind you." The ensign nodded and raced off, leaving Captain Vance to struggle to her feet. Her ship was gone, but her crew still lived, and they still had a mission to complete. She made her way to the airlock and stepped out into the void, her lungs burning from the lack of air. As she floated through the empty space, she activated her jetpack and propelled herself toward the nearest fighter bay. Upon arrival, she found a chaotic scene. Crew members were scrambling to board the remaining fighters, their faces etched with determination and fear. Captain Vance quickly located her trusty old fighter, the one she had flown countless times before. She climbed aboard and sealed the hatch, strapping herself into the cockpit. "All hands, this is Captain Vance. Our ship is gone, but we're not out of the fight yet. Target the enemy flagship and protect the boarding teams. Let's bring this to an end." Her words were met with a chorus of affirmative responses and a renewed sense of purpose. The fighters spun and dove, racing toward the enemy flagship. Captain Vance focused on her target, her hands flying over the controls as she prepared for the final assault. The enemy flagship was larger and more heavily armed than any of their fighters, but they had the element of surprise. Captain Vance fired her fighter's engines and charged toward the flagship, her weapons blazing. The enemy ships turned to face her, their turrets tracking her approach. The battle was swift and brutal, but Captain Vance's skills and her crew's determination prevailed. The flagship exploded in a blinding flash, and the rest of the enemy fleet began to crumble under the onslaught. As the last enemy ship surrendered, Captain Vance's fighter slowed to a halt, drifting in the void. She keyed her comm and waited for a response. After a moment, a familiar voice came over the line. "Captain, this is Lieutenant Commander Data. We've secured the Keystone. The light of freedom is ours once more." Captain Vance let out a sigh of relief and a small smile crept across her face. "Well done, Commander. Well done indeed. Prepare to return to the surface and begin the long process of rebuilding. I wouldn't have made it without you." The calm went silent as Captain Vance took in the view of the Keystone floating peacefully before her. It had been a long and arduous journey, fraught with danger and loss. But they had prevailed. They had restored hope to a beaten people and lit the flame of freedom once more. As the fighters began to return to the surface, Captain Vance's thoughts drifted back to her fallen ship. She owed it a debt that could never be repaid. But she knew that in death, it had given new life to their cause. A new ship would be built, and they would continue to fight for the freedom of all sentient beings across the galaxy. As her fighter docked with the remains of the flagship, now converted into a makeshift command center, Captain Vance disembarked and was greeted by a throng of cheering crew members. She smiled and raised her hands in acknowledgement, feeling the weight of command settle more comfortably on her shoulders. "Captain," said Lieutenant Commander Data, approaching her. "There's someone who wishes to speak with you." Captain Vance raised an eyebrow, curious as to who could possibly want to talk to her now. She followed Data to a nearby comm station, where a haggard-looking man was waiting. "Captain Vance," he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "My name is Reynolds. I was one of the scientists working on the Keystone. I just wanted to thank you and your crew for what you've done. Words cannot express our gratitude." Captain Vance was taken aback by the man's sincerity. "Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. We were just doing what we had to do. It's a relief to know that our efforts have not been in vain." She paused for a moment, then added, "I'm sure there will be much work ahead of us as we begin the process of rebuilding. If you or any of your colleagues would like to help, we would be honored by your presence. Together, I believe we can create a better future for our people." Dr. Reynolds' eyes lit up at the prospect. "I would be delighted to assist, Captain. My expertise lies in the field of energy research, and I believe there are many applications for the technology we've developed. I look forward to working with your crew and contributing to the rebuilding effort." As they finished their conversation, Captain Vance felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. They had faced seemingly insurmountable odds and emerged victorious. Now, with the Keystone in their possession and the support of the scientists who had created it, they could truly begin the long journey towards a brighter future. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity as they began the process of setting up a temporary base of operations on the surface of the planet. The crew of the fallen flagship, now repentant and eager to atone for their past actions, swore their allegiance to Captain Vance and the cause of freedom. Captain Vance took some time to tour the base, making sure that everything was running smoothly. She stopped to chat with Lieutenant Commander Data, who was coordinating efforts to restore power to the remains of the flagship. The android's efficient, methodical nature was a welcome addition to the chaos of the base. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the desolate landscape, Captain Vance found a quiet spot to sit and reflect on the day's events. Despite the hardships they had endured, she felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over her. They had achieved the impossible, and the future now lay before them, full of promise and possibility. She thought about Dr. Reynolds and the other scientists, and the important role they would play in rebuilding their society. She thought about her crew, many of whom had risked their lives to achieve this victory. And she thought about the countless others throughout the galaxy who were no doubt suffering under the yoke of tyranny and oppression. The stars twinkled overhead, a seemingly infinite display of hope and possibility. Captain Vance took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with her newfound position of leadership. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that they were on the right path. As she sat there, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Lieutenant Commander Data standing behind her, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Captain, are you all right?" he asked. "You seem lost in thought." She smiled warmly at the android. "I was just thinking about everything that's happened, Data. It's been overwhelming to say the least. But I know we're on the right track now. Together, we can make a real difference. Data nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, Captain. Your leadership has been exemplary. I am honored to serve under your command. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, gazing up at the stars. Despite the differences in their nature and backgrounds, they shared a bond forged in adversity and strengthened by shared purpose. They were a team, united by their determination to see their world free and thriving once more. As the night sky began to deepen, Captain Vance stood up, stretching her limbs. "Well, Data," she said with a sigh, "I suppose we should get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day. Let's make sure we're ready for whatever challenges come our way." The android nodded in agreement, and the two of them began to make their way back to the makeshift camp where the rest of the crew was settling in for the night. The flames of the fires cast flickering shadows against the rugged terrain, a poignant reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. Captain Vance and Lieutenant Commander Data made their way back to the camp, nodding to the crew members they passed. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the scent of smoke and burning wood. The stars overhead twinkled brilliantly against the deep velvet of the sky. As they approached their tent, Captain Vance paused, taking one last look at the landscape before ducking inside. The tent was spacious and well-lit, with comfortable cots lining the walls. Captain Vance carefully removed her uniform jacket, folding it neatly and placing it on a small wooden chest at the foot of her cot. She stretched out on the soft mattress, sighing contentedly. "Captain, do you require anything before I retire for the evening?" Data asked, hovering nearby. "No, thank you, Data. You've been a great help today. I appreciate it." "It has been my pleasure, Captain. If you need anything in the night, do not hesitate to summon me." "Thank you, Data. Good night." Captain Vance closed her eyes, drifting off to sleep almost immediately. Outside, the android stood vigilant for several more minutes before finally retiring to his own cot, his optical sensors scanning the camp and the surrounding landscape, ensuring that all was secure. Throughout the night, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees and causing the tent flaps to flutter gently. Captain Vance slept soundly, undisturbed by the sounds of the planet. When she awoke the next morning, she felt refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. She rose from her cot, stretching her limbs and yawning loudly. The familiar weight of her uniform jacket reassured her as she pulled it on. After a quick wash-up at the nearby makeshift bathroom, she emerged, her hair still damp from her washing. "Good morning, Captain," Data said as she approached. "Shall I prepare your morning meal?" "That would be lovely, Data. Thank you." Captain Vance smiled at the android. As they waited for the meal to be ready, she took a moment to survey the camp. The crew was already up and about, busying themselves with their morning routines. The fire pits were being tended to, weapons checked, and supplies organized. Despite the hardships they had faced so far, there was an air of determination and resilience that filled her with hope. Breakfast was served shortly afterward, a hearty stew of vegetables, meat, and grains, cooked over the fire. Captain Vance took her seat at the makeshift dining table, Data floating nearby. As they ate, she surveyed the faces of her crew, studying each one for any signs of weariness or dissent. But all she saw were focused, determined expressions. After breakfast, Captain Vance called a meeting of her senior officers. They gathered around a small fire pit, sitting on rocks or logs. Captain Vance stood before them, her presence commanding. "All right, everyone. Let's go over our plan for today. As you all know, our main objective is to locate the rebel encampment and establish contact. Lieutenant Smith, what is our current status on that front?" The young lieutenant, a recent addition to the crew, cleared his throat. "Well, Captain, we've been using the orbital data to triangulate the likely location. We're fairly certain we've narrowed it down to a specific area about 20 kilometers southwest of here. Captain Vance nodded, impressed by the young man's confidence. Very well. Lieutenant Commander Data, please coordinate with Lieutenant Smith and ensure that our scouting party is prepared to move out as soon as possible. Lieutenant Williams, you'll be in charge of the rear guard, making sure that we're not ambushed while we're en route. Any questions or concerns? There was a brief pause as everyone on the council exchanged glances. Finally, Lieutenant Commander Torres spoke up. Captain, I think it's important that we also consider the possibility of diplomatic negotiations with the rebels. There may be another way to resolve this conflict without further bloodshed. Captain Vance considered this for a moment before replying. That is indeed a valid point, Commander. I appreciate your concern for diplomacy. However, given the urgency of the situation and the potential gravity of the threats we face, I believe it is prudent to proceed with caution and to prepare for all contingencies. With that said, you are welcome to volunteer for the diplomatic mission if you feel you are best suited for it. For now, however, let us focus on locating the rebel encampment and ascertaining their intentions before moving forward with any negotiations. The crew exchanged glances, nodding in agreement with the captain's assessment. Even so, they couldn't ignore the value of Commander Torres' advice. It was clear that they all wanted to avoid further bloodshed if at all possible. As they prepared to set out for the rebel encampment, the tension in the air was palpable, but there was also a sense of determination and purpose that drove them forward. Check back soon for the part 4 of this sci-fi adventure. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it.